Welcome to Building the Future, hosted by Kevin Horick. With millions of listeners a month, Building the Future has quickly become one of the fastest rising programs, with a focus on interviewing startups, entrepreneurs, investors, CEOs, and more. The radio and TV show airs in 15 markets across the globe, including Silicon Valley. For full showtimes, past episodes, or to sponsor the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com.
Today's show is brought to you by the award-winning NordVPN. I've been using Nord for years now because it secures my internet traffic and keeps my data private, especially when traveling or on public Wi-Fi. NordVPN has servers in over 60 countries, does not log your data, unlocks Netflix and other geographic restrictions on entertainment content, and has a 30-day money-back guarantee. To save 70% on a subscription, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com/NordVPN or use the promo code BTFuture. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Frits Habermann. He's the CEO at PicMonkey, and he's also a nature photographer. Frits, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Appreciate it.
I'm excited to have you back on the show. This is kind of a part two, you could say. We really spent a bunch of time in the first kind of recording covering your background and what exactly PicMonkey is. So if people want a really good in-depth interview, then go on the website and check that out. But do you maybe still want to give us a bit of background on yourself, maybe some career highlights, and then what exactly you do at PicMonkey and how it came to be and what exactly you guys do?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. I have a career that spans sort of the last 25 years or so. I think I cut my teeth after grad school at a company called Aldus, which was purchased by Adobe. I think the most interesting thing we did there was InDesign. So a lot of your listeners probably know that. Sure. So a layout program that a lot of magazines and newspapers use nowadays. So there's a lot of really interesting war stories in there that, I think my history or really sort of was the about 18, 20 years that I spent in Adobe here and there. I've also done a lot of different business aspects for folks like Real Networks, especially during the MP3 and real heyday of online music in the beginning, in the late 90s. Then I always, I think I mentioned this last time, but I always try to pick places I go where I would really love to use their product. Sure. And that was certainly the case for Adobe and Aldus. I'm really visually oriented with my photography stuff. And it was always great to use new products like when Photoshop came out or even when Lightroom came out. As a photographer, I got to use that, way in advance. So I love that kind of stuff. But for me as well, I like to marry sort of my interests with then furthering a part of the landscape. In this case, my next stop was PopCap Games. Online gaming, social gaming, mobile gaming, this kind of stuff. So we make Plants vs. Zombies and Bejeweled and things like that.
That's awesome.
And so that was a great experience. Super creative people in and of themselves, and that was the first time where I really recognized for me that going places where I want to use the product is really, really necessary. Not just rewarding, but wow, you can have so many more insights and interesting things to think about when you do that.
Yeah, it amazes me how many people don't actually, maybe if they're not necessarily the target market, but that don't actually use the product like a user would.
Yeah.
Right? Like I think that you can catch so many weird inconsistencies or flows just by actually using the product, right? Because I find sometimes when you're doing design or development, you're just building the pages or the sections, and then you don't actually see how they connect and flow together. And we'll probably get into some more of that kind of stuff later on. Sorry to cut you off, but it just point came to me.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really important point. That feeling of sort of, hey, I've been siloed in this particular feature in and of itself, and I don't see the bigger picture. The forest through the trees. I think a very common problem that even any of the companies I've been at suffers, but you can see it in some of the designs that come out from folks as well, and you can kind of tell it. You can tell it, as a customer in and of itself. But I think you're right. That for me is important. Is understanding the product that you have, but really being a customer, right? So that's easy when you're working at a gaming company, right?
Sure. Yeah, fair enough.
That's really easy. It's like I'm standing there waiting for my latte. I'm going to play a quick game of Bejeweled. But,
Yeah.
my next stop was lynda.com. So Linda Weinman and her husband, Bruce, started that company a number of years ago, probably about 20 years ago now. And, that was really set up as a learning company where they initially created videos, sort of multimedia, DVDs, and things like that. And with the bubble bursting, they saw a great opportunity in doing that online. And when I went there, that was another one of those like, hey, quite selfishly, I was a photographer. They had great videos on photography and how to use, in this case, Lightroom and things like this.
Sure.
So to me, that was another one of those. Well, if you go along the customer journey as a customer, and that's where you work, and you have influence upon that product, you can really, be some greater than its parts kind of situation. But it also really, is a very rewarding kind of experience as a person working in the industry. So lynda.com was a great experience. We sold to LinkedIn a number of years ago. And I wound up at PicMonkey mostly because, again, for me, the industry has changed so much around what I'd put in air quotes as visual communication. And by that, I mean, there's a lot of people nowadays that have access to tools, whether it's your phone, whether it's, the internet, that are wanting to do more than just, take a selfie or put a sticker on something. They're actually, they're creating their personas online, or they are selling things on an Etsy or a Shopify, or they're creating their own websites, or they are, part of what we call the gigster community, where, people are finding side hustles and things like this that really the internet has opened up as a possibility. And so all of these folks, what we see over the last couple of years, and why I wound up at PicMonkey, was that this area is both exploding, but is in real need of those sort of accessible tools, if you will, that allow you to really stand out from the crowd and really visually communicate. So I came here as sort of a photographer and had a product and technology, wound up as a CEO. And it's a ton of fun watching that sort of evolution that I really think we're in almost day one of, if you will.
So give us a bit of an overview of what exactly PicMonkey does. I get you just kind of give a quick, but give us some of the features and functionality, because it's actually really quite innovative what you guys are actually building.
Yeah, so I think you start with PicMonkey back before all of this sort of what I'd call e-commerce, digital marketing stuff was really at the forefront, and then PicMonkey spun out of Google, which had bought this other company called Picnic, and we pretty much did just sort of like an online Photoshop built in Flash, etc.
Sure.
And so it was very accessible online. It really called out, 90% out of Photoshop and just said, people don't need that. And what you really need is very quick edits to a photo. It was all free at the time. And it was a really great start. And what you noticed within that is that with the phones and the cameras, improving to 12 megapixels and just ubiquity of that photography and photos, just to update photos, really became more of a commodity. And you can do most everything that PicMonkey did, say 5 years ago, just in the phone itself, like in iOS or Android,
which is really cool, actually.
It's really cool. And some of the new, the iPhone 10 and 11 and stuff like this that they have in there, just some of the capabilities are, really fantastic in terms of lighting and just all that kind of stuff. But what that then meant is that at the same time, again, this explosion of, hey, I'm a person and I have a bead store or a candle making, or I want to make T-shirts. This aspect really became more than just one thing that they were creating, but really became a number of different, what I'll call use cases. And you'll probably hear me say that a lot, but the industry changed from being a person like a graphic designer or a photographer.
Sure.
and into what we call solopreneurs, which is just a fancy name for people that are starting their own business and have to wear a lot of different hats. And so if you look at those kind of people, what they're doing is one day, or maybe all in one day, they have to advertise, they have to take photos of their stock, they have to price things, they have to market it on, any kind of social platform or in their stores. They have to create a website, they have to go talk to their customers, they have to deal with refunds. So all of this stuff wherein what at the end of the day, they don't want to go to art school to become a graphic designer. They don't want to be, an MBA, and they don't have the experience in marketing in and of itself. So that set of use cases, which is very wide, is really what we're trying to penetrate with sort of this visual communication stuff. And the solution that we've then built is a pretty easily accessible product that has a lot of content for you. You can easily just walk into PicMonkey and pull out some templates, put in your photo, slap some text on it, and publish it. But we also have things that, like stock photography, if you want to make it look a little bit more professional. And then where we sort of differentiate, and this is what I'd say is the difference between sort of a lot of more easy to use but limited in functionality products and the higher end Adobe, is we sort of sit in the middle, and we've just replatformed our product in essence. And I took a lot of the, let's say, the philosophical approaches we used in InDesign to really build a deep platform that has a lot of capabilities for folks. And the trick for us then is, how do you present that capability in an easy to use way so that you don't become a Photoshop, in terms of its learning curve, and yet you provide the depth of technology that can really make any one of these people do a use case that is, very individual for them, really stands out and winds up being professional. And so that mixed with, a very accessible pricing and things like that, that's what we're trying to solve.
Sure.
And at the same time, kind of be there a bit more as almost like a mentor along the way, right? We're here to help you. So more than just the tool, but also, we have now a learning center with a lot of videos and things like that, and how to do your brand or how to make a logo and things like this. So that sort of destination, one-stop shopping for solopreneurs and digital marketers is where we're going.
Sure. Well, I think the other thing too, and just to kind of elaborate on your point earlier, is if you're a brand and you're just starting up and it's one, or maybe there's less than a handful of you, and you have new product and come in and you need to get it on Instagram with this afternoon, for example, you don't have the time, money, or really probably even the resources to go to a traditional agency to create you all those unique templates that you could either potentially add in your own if you know the software, or get them to do it, because the turnaround on that stuff is going to be probably weeks. Maybe if you're lucky, you work with a freelancer that can turn it around in a few days, but you want it out within hours, not within days, right? And I think that's the thing that you guys solve for a lot of people. And you could correct me if I'm wrong. I think you even solve that problem for the professionals that know the Photoshops and the Lightrooms and other design software, because it's quicker to use your software, right? Like if I started an e-commerce company, it makes way more sense for me to use you guys than using the traditional kind of Photoshops of the world in a lot of cases, because I have to create a lot of that stuff from scratch or go find other templates. It's like, well, you guys just already have all that stuff there for me. Is that kind of fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's super fair. And not only that, but then, I'll add a couple of different things to that. So yes, absolutely. If I am that, again, solopreneur or what have you, to your point, I don't have days and I don't have, 5 or 6 zeros at the end of the check I can write to somebody that can do this stuff for me. And so for me, I need fast turnaround. And on top of that, I need I need somebody to help me understand what's good and what's not. If I
Yeah.
already understood that, then I'd be a graphic designer or I'd already know those things and that's no problem. And I'm probably using Adobe anyway. So likely it's the case that it's like, I don't have the time to understand what's good and what's not, what will help me and what won't. So that's where templates, as an example, or stock photography really suddenly help me, right? I can just say like, hey, I need a picture of a beach, type that in, and or an Instagram post with a beach shot on it, type that in, and the tools just give you that kind of stuff, and you know that it's going to be quality. So that's number one. The second, I think your point around having to do this quickly, what sort of the next step that you typically find, because a lot of people can go to either free products or other places, and this isn't unique to PicMonkey, but just in general,
Sure.
and just quickly do something that they need right away, and that's fine. But after a while, you're running a business, and so you need to keep these things organized, as an
Yeah.
example. You need to keep them on whatever machine or place you're at. I need that to be accessible. Hey, I'm in San Francisco suddenly talking to a client, and I didn't bring my laptop or whatever. How do I get to that document? Um, I need to talk to my client over there, and they just, they're in Europe today. How do I do that? Well, tools like PicMonkey then give you that extra level. In our case, collaboration, or in our case, cloud storage and things like this. And so the tools and the sort of the maturation of people as they have these particular needs as they're running their business, the tools have to stay ahead of all these needs, and at the same time, that's what we think PicMonkey does, obviously, but at the same time provide that in an easy to use way. So for us, it's always a how do you provide it in an easy to use way that doesn't make it so that you kind of, to use a technical term,
Yeah.
nerf the functionality, right? Because that just makes that's for the customers out there, they know potentially what they want, or they want to be surprised
Sure.
and really delighted about things like that. So I think that that's where, from a PicMonkey perspective, yes, all of those things we want to try to address, but we also want to mature with the needs and provide the functionality going forward.
And also being able to build graphics for the different platforms and different sizes, right? And kind of
Yes,
repurpose the same types of content and designs across the different platforms.
absolutely. That's another one. In addition to what I was just mentioning, as you mature, you'll see quickly like, oh, wait, Instagram, I'm getting this much, return on investment for that. I want to try Pinterest.
Yeah.
And I want to connect directly into their ad platform. Pinterest is a totally different way of doing that. Well, I can just go to PicMonkey. I already have my design. Some of the new stuff that we're about to release is going to be really cool in terms of multiple destination kind of things, where you can just easily say like, hey, I need these 5 different formats. Give me an Etsy, give me a Instagram post, and then give me a Pinterest pin long form. And then, that kind of thing is really, really critical. And that's what I mean by the products and the platform staying ahead of the needs of, the folks as they explore their needs for their business.
Yeah. No, totally. So I want to kind of dive into some of the design, kind of UX side of it and get your thoughts on a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think maybe the simplest place to start is, what does creativity mean to you?
hmm Well, there's many answers to. Certainly, as a photographer, I think I have one answer, and I think, as a musician, I have a different answer. But I think that for me, I think there's a certain combination of what I would say is intent and flow. And for me, I think intent is that sort of almost the hard skills around, resolve or focus or being resilient. And I think that, if I think of my days at Adobe with InDesign, that was that's back in the day of shrink wrap software, predominant, big big heavyweight iron cast sort of coding, C++, and super, diligent stuff. But we also had to convince the company, in essence, that we were going to replace an already successful product in PageMaker, and
Which
basically,
you did do.
which we did do exactly. But I think the point of that is that there was an amount of focus and resilience that you need to basically overcome or break through or push through in order to get that stuff really both, obviously hit the street, but also realizing your vision. And I think that those hard skills, whether it's resilience, focus, or any of these kinds of things, I think is one side of that equation, if you will. And I think the other side of that for me is flow, if you will. So that's a term that is bandied about a lot, but not a lot of people really understand it. If you read Flow by Michele Csikszentmihalyi, something like that, I forget, his last name is really hard to pronounce, but
Sure.
but that book is fantastic around that feeling of what really is flow. And to me, that is an important ingredient that you can tell when it's missing. I certainly tell it when it's missing for me in photography or in music. And I think the aspects of it that are interesting from a software perspective is maybe what we were just touching on, or in terms of knowing the customer and being being one of the customers. And so I would think of ingredients to that would be things like immersion into the product, immersion into what people are really trying to do. I don't know if I gave you this example last time, but InDesign is a great example where things like character styles and paragraph styles were a great introduction. We did that, but when we saw people really just cutting and pasting text, and all they wanted was like make this thing over here look like that thing. That was a great example where it's like, hey, wait a minute. We created all these constructs around basically a simple use case that people wanted to do, which was make this thing look like that thing and make it super easy for me. And you can't really understand that unless you really immerse yourself.
Totally.
And so that flow aspect is really important, mixed with potentially then I think the other ingredient for me would be flexibility. I know in a lot of cases, like PopCap, I'll take a great example of PopCap, where we had a big hit on our hands with Plants vs. Zombies.
Sure.
And it took a while to make PVZ2. And that was because we moved, we tried a whole bunch of different themes, and we tried a whole bunch of different perspectives on how to make the game better. But that idea of being flexible and at the same time really immersing yourself allowed us ultimately to build a really fantastic game in PVZ2, and ultimately wound up building Garden Warfare. The team up in Vancouver made that because we were like, hey, let's try that. Let's be flexible around what this can do. And that in and of itself has been a great sort of thing for both EA and PopCap in and of itself. So to me, I think this feeling of flow mixed with intent is interesting to think about for user experiences. I hope your listeners know the Christopher Alexander book, Timeless Way of Building.
Sure.
So that to me is one of these Bibles that I think everybody should be reading if you do user experience along with design of everyday things. And to me, it's a great book that also inspired a lot of computer scientists. The Gang of Four, when they created design patterns for computer science, based it on Alexander's book. And that talks a lot about, he's doing it from an architecture point of view. And his moniker is, creating spaces that live. And he's got all these patterns in how to build, a corner room, for example, with a window that faces in a particular direction so the sun comes in. And that's then a space that, quote, lives. Applying intent focus to user experiences, and what would it mean, or how can you think about creating user experiences that then, quote, live, if you will? Are there constructs that you can put together that make the product very usable and a utility, and at the same time very creative, but in a very functional way? So that's kind of how I look at those things. Again, my answer for photography or music might be way different, but
Sure.
hopefully that threads in the middle a little bit.
No, it's interesting. So how do you apply creativity to interfaces? Because so many, well, there's that one side where, especially if you're doing mobile stuff for Android and iOS, like Apple and Google both have really well documented design guidelines
Yep.
that they kind of expect you to at least follow to a certain degree. You can obviously stray from that, and then you have a bunch of other issues. So how do you actually take creativity and actually apply it to the software that you're building? Because you're building it nowadays for so many different screen sizes, so many different platforms, and potentially users from their teens into maybe they're retired, right? Depending
Yep.
on what you're building.
Yeah, the geography and just all of that kind of stuff is also super interesting within there. I think it does wind up being a combination of a lot of attributes. And so I think it's very easy to come into user interface design and kind of go, that looks cool. I need a button, or I'm just going to follow the Apple guidelines and things like that. But I think customers are savvy enough. Certainly, I feel that where I can walk into something and kind of look at it and go, it just doesn't feel right, and a lot of times people won't be able to really say, why doesn't that feel right? I followed all the guidelines, but it just doesn't feel right. And I think that there are a couple of these attributes that are super important. And I think that, they're anywhere from visual things like the color palette that people use. You can, in the early days of the internet, how many of us saw blue text on a green background, things like this, right? It's just super garish. I can't read it. It's all about visual, it's not about what was written there. It's not about the website. It's just simply a visual aspect where it's like, I can't read that. So it's not functional, let alone it looks ugly because the person didn't understand how actually complementary colors work. So, you could put that in one bucket. I think the second one is, how many of us look at even a wiki page, if you will, or interfaces that just absolutely, cram in as much as they possibly can with really little buttons here or there. And it's like, wow, that's super daunting. How do I approach that particular thing? How do I get at the functionality? Now, there's certain exceptions to that as well. But a lot of the times, it's sort of like guidelines go out the window. It's just like, I want to give one big interface for everybody. And a lot of times that information overload is really a problem. And that's where you get into, sort of what you're talking about as well, the difference between some of the kinds of users. I like to differentiate it into, sort of the beginner or the people that are on ramping versus the experts.
Okay.
And if I think about, I'll just take the music interface just to take a different area.
Sure.
So I think you and I mentioned Ableton and Logic Pro last time. Logic Pro has a really nice way of, going into an advanced mode, and a lot of other products do as well, where it's like I can quickly make music, even though the buttons are small and all the rest of this, but they know the difference between they're trying to on-ramp me, and now that I'm an accomplished, at least bit twiddler, then, now how do I get at the real power of the thing? And that holding that within an interface is also, I think, a very important attribute. I do think that there's an aspect of utility wherein the user journey is super important. And so the third bucket I would think about it is you have to test. You have to test a lot, and you can't leave things sort of on the shelf. So we do a lot with usertesting.com, with Full Story, with other things where we're constantly looking at how the customer is using our product. And what worked, say, 2 years ago might not be working anymore because the landscape has changed. Either younger people or older people, or as I was mentioning, these solopreneurs or whatever, they have different needs. And so watching that customer journey, watching their steps, they come into the product. What did they search on? They are coming here, they're looking for, I don't know, logo making. So you start you start your product and you give them something else. You give them, a something for Instagram post. Well, that person's going to be like, I don't want that. That's not what I'm here for. I'm here for logo making. So sort of culturing them along the way and really helping smooth that path and understanding logo making is about, okay, here's already a predetermined size. Here's some example logos that you can make. We also have, let's say, something like curved text, for example. What's your name? And we'll make it for you. We've got blend modes or other things. Once you try something that looks kind of like this so that you can explore. All of these things are super critical for understanding, again, this utility mixed with understanding immersing yourself in the problem that you're trying to solve. Without that, I think you get back to it's just a pretty interface for something that doesn't actually work. So I'd say those are at least 3 ingredients, and there's probably zillions more.
Sure. Today's show is brought to you by FreshBooks, an all-in-one small business invoicing and accounting solution. I've been using FreshBooks for over a decade to send estimates for time and expense tracking, sending invoices, and collecting payments online. Then at tax time, I just generate a report that can be sent off to an accountant. To get a free trial of FreshBooks, please go to buildingthefutureshow.com/freshbooks. What are your thoughts on leveraging frameworks for some of that stuff, like the Android or iOS guidelines, or any of the other web frameworks that have kind of been popular over the years?
Yeah, I actually think that there's a lot of science that went into that, and that is a great start. And sometimes it's the only place that you need to go. It depends on the complexity of your interface and things like this. If I think about, and it's also actually in the landscape itself. So in the gaming world, for example, how do you think about that? The layout of your game is your game itself.
Right.
So, adhering to some guidelines is probably not what you want to be doing. But if you're mapping your controls to your game console, you probably want to use, normal things, right? Using the left stick click down for shooting in a shooter game is probably not what you want to be doing.
Right.
So there's, I think, certain aspects that's way different than something like, if I pick on InDesign for a minute, we did a lot of different things that were not part of any guidelines. Now, certainly there are some, like, hey, an OK button on Mac looks like this, and it's in the bottom right, whereas on Windows it looks like that, and it's over here. And what's the default? But ultimately, at the end of the day, the main interface that you're always working with are palettes, are the canvas itself, and the constructs of things like a pointer tool, or let me select something within a group or something like that. And those are things that a platform may have guidelines around, like, hey, selection should work like this, but that's very generic, and you never want your product to be really least common denominator. And a lot of these, architectures, especially ones that are cross-platform frameworks, tend to at times be least common denominator, and that's what you got to watch out for, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, and to give Adobe a lot of credit here, when, like, early on, this is kind of going to date me to like the early 2000s.
Yep.
The shortcuts to do simple things between Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, and Flash, for example, were all different.
Yes.
And Adobe fixed that over, the last decade or maybe longer. I can't even remember. But there was a real pain point for a lot of people that were switching between 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces of Adobe software, and you had to remember all the different shortcuts to do the same thing, basically. Yes. So, right. But I think that kind of proves the point. Is sure, they acquired some software and like they merged with Macromedia. So it wasn't necessarily their fault, but that's a simple example that I think a lot of people could maybe hopefully remember, or at least relate to, that, you know, there was a huge problem here. They fixed it over time, but it does take time to sort some of these weird inconsistencies out across platforms and sometimes across different software.
Yeah, actually, you know, that's a fantastic example because, you know, it sounds like a super innocuous one, right? So,
Yeah.
and I was at the forefront of all of those debates at the time, where we were talking about like, okay, you know, so Adobe just buys all this has PageMaker, all these people have particular, shortcuts that they use. A really great one for PageMaker customers was Command D.
Okay.
What do you think Command D did?
Uh,
Probably delete, duplicate, something like that.
yeah,
Yeah,
I was going to
yeah,
say duplicate, but yeah.
yeah, duplicate, right? So Illustrator does no, it does place.
Oh,
And
like
the
place in
big
place or just
no
place?
place, just
Okay.
place. So
Okay.
like, you know, and we had a special place tool in and of itself. So you come into PageMaker, you have a blank canvas and you go, hey, this is an aggregating app. I got to slap a whole bunch of things on my canvas. All the
Right.
PageMaker customers were Command D. I don't know if Quark had the same shortcut, but I want to say they did. I might be wrong. But the point being that all of our customers who are now, we're about to ask to upgrade into InDesign,
Right.
and they're all sort of, you know, those people that are still using Quark Express. We're now basically saying to them, okay, you know, you use PageMaker, you know that Command D is place, but now we're going to make Command D duplicate. So all those people walked in and they all went Command D and they're like, what's going on? Nothing's happening.
Yeah.
And so these little things wound up becoming, you know, we had debate upon debate on exactly what you're talking about. But sometimes it's, you know, when as you get different customers that all come from a different perspective,
Sure.
these sorts of things evolve with you, and you're never going to make everybody happy. But to your point, you know, now we're in a world where it's like, yeah, Command D is duplicate. Well, everybody does duplicate that way. And what is place? Well, it's probably something different, but you know, I don't even know what it is,
Yeah.
and that's okay because we've been either conditioned or, you know, there's younger people or people that have been brought up on, you know, those particular shortcuts. And I think that's true for a lot of these things as you make changes in interfaces that really exist for people, that sometimes even the littlest things can really start off a lot of different conversations that make it hard for people.
Sure. And then what are your thoughts around actually using some of the native platform components because you get some of the accessibility features
Yep.
and the security stuff, and it, you know, it's, they're probably going to work with the next version of the OS, whether it's on mobile or desktop, or what are your thoughts around kind of leveraging that just because of some of the built-in features that you get that you don't have to maintain
Yeah.
yourself?
Yeah, there's a lot of goodness in that. I mean, we use a lot of open source code, we use a lot of platform code. I think there's a couple of different questions to answer. To me, one of my sort of, as I've grown up in this industry a bit, you know, you obviously have the buy versus build question.
Sure.
And to me, I think that most engineers, when I was a young engineer, put it this way, I liked the build solution a lot.
Me too.
And yeah, exactly. So, you know, it's like, I can do this faster than this, and I can add my own little quirks into it that really solve exactly my problem. And as you mature in that, as you've probably found, is you wind up going, oh shit, I got that code that I, you know, still have from 10 years
Yep.
ago, and I
Yep.
got to maintain it because there's some new upgrade, you know, or things like this. And the way that I think of it nowadays is what if I have a buy versus build, I ask about that technology or that thing. Is this something that I want us to become an expert in? Is this domain knowledge that I need to have?
Sure.
And so that's a, you know, an example where it'd be sort of like database storage or cloud, you know, storage or something like this. That's not an expertise I need. Now, in the case of a lynda.com, at that time, I actually needed it.
Yeah.
I needed my own
Interesting.
hardware and all the rest of that stuff,
Yeah, because it didn't
but
exist, right?
didn't exist. And,
Yeah.
you know, AWS was certainly there in the beginnings, but, you know, there's a lot of technology that where it's like, whether it's security or a bunch of other things where it's like, no, you know what? I can't, if I go down or the East Coast goes down for Amazon or something like that, I need to be very quick in spinning up my other servers and things like this. And so I need to be 24/7 around the world, all the rest of that. So maybe that's a capability I need to own in-house. But in the case of a PicMonkey, for example, no, I don't need to spend time on that. Or if I'm going to make a content management system at Adobe, well, a lot of my customers use content management systems. So you get something like Bridge, for example. That's a real good capabilities. So but do I need to recreate WordPress for my blog site? Probably not. So to me, I think that there's those aspects of like you got to answer that question, but I think there's another one which is time to market.
Okay.
So for example, our PicMonkey mobile app is what we basically call a core app across both platforms,
right? And
then we have some edge code for iOS and for Android. But the idea of the core app, at least, was our rendering engine and everything that goes into creating that. I only have to write once.
Yeah, smart.
And when I have to maintain it or add new capabilities, I only have to do that once. And again, that goes back. Yes, I'm still answering that question of its capabilities that I want to have in house, but it's also a time to market question. If I can do that. Otherwise I'm going to get out competed, if you will. I'll get muscled out if I don't. If I spend 2.5 years on a completely new mobile platform, that's not going to help me either. So I think that there's a lot of real great stuff that people write out there, especially on the open source side,
totally,
where it's like, I don't need to rewrite that, and there's a lot of people writing it for me. So awesome. Until I need the capabilities myself, and it's a real value add that my company's based on.
Well, I also think a lot of people also forget that you can fork an open source project, and in a lot of cases, the only requirement is that you maybe commit some code back, or sometimes they don't care at all. Sometimes you might have to pay a small fee, and that's tens of dollars or maybe hundreds of dollars. I think some of the bigger ones are maybe thousands of dollars, but even if you had to spend a few $100s or a few $1,000s on something that's maintained by a global community, you're going to get your money's worth, right? And there's a new version of Android and iOS, either a beta version or a full release. I know it's not quite 6 months depending on platform, and then, Windows is rolling out every year. The Mac is rolling out every year, and other operating systems and other things are updating so fast, right? That you can't, unless you have like an army team of people maintaining all this stuff and you have an unlimited budget, you probably can't maintain all the stuff that you use these days.
Yeah, that because essentially that's what you do have, right? You have an unlimited budget because you're not paying anything. You're right. Yeah. And you have an unlimited number of resources, which is essentially, the rest of the world, if you will, or those coders that are actually, on the platform itself. So absolutely, I think that stuff is really great. Now, the only issue around it, though, is where you get into like, okay, well, I just need this part of it. And that's where it gets a little bit like, oh, okay, well, now I need, something, a sub allocator for the memory management thing that works like this, and that doesn't work for me. Or this thing was tested on that platform, and I really want to do it on a, new ARM chip for blah, 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 that only has this much memory. So there's those kinds of things that, yes, you can create and then obviously give it back to the open source community. But at times you do sit there and kind of go like, oh, there's like 5 things that I have to kind of change. And it's never a one size fits all kind of thing. And I always say, choose the problem you want to have.
Yeah.
I'd rather have that problem, if you will, than, a skyrocketing OpEx because I have to build something myself. Sure. So, there's those kinds of things as well.
But then how do you make sure you still have a good user experience while leveraging these open source things? You've probably built some custom stuff around that or with that. And then some of the maybe paid stuff that you've bought, because that gets really tricky, especially when you're not mashing code, but like, you know what I mean? You're kind of just putting it all together, hoping it all plays nice together, and then trying to make a really good UX, right? And you have to sacrifice some things on both sides.
Yeah, I think you need to really, first, you really need to think about it ahead of time. There's so many companies, some very successful companies that, when they do M&A, for example, they just simply aggregate a whole bunch of companies under, say, an umbrella site, and they never talk to each other because it's just too hard.
Yeah.
They were never built that way, and so the interfaces are way different, yet at the same time, they overlap each other a lot in terms of functionality. It's very confusing for the customer. I think a similar thing in terms of actual, software engineering. If you have a technology that you need in order to create a real great product solution, to me, that feels like okay, well, use some forethought, but also use some really, canonical, if you will, computer science or even design tenets. So, for example, in computer science, I would say, and back to this pattern stuff that we were talking about, separation of user interface from model code, if you will, this idea of the architecture underneath the waterline is the engine that just moves things, and the interface is the stuff that the customer sees above the waterline. And that stuff, as they communicate, needs to be sort of separated. They can't be intermixing within each other. And if you're able to do that, then you can kind of say like, hey, I don't know how this interface, and this is a little altruistic, but I don't know how this interface is really going to connect to this engine, but I need to be able to, in the case of visuals, I need to be able to flatten images from a raster perspective or draw, on a screen somehow, or represent a spline, if you will. And then it's up to now you go to the interface and you go, I don't know how that's done, but for me, all I have to now think about, is how am I going to present this to the customer? And you can architect, think deeply about, some of these patterns and things like this that actually start communicating between those particular models without getting them intertwined. And I think the remaining problem then winds up being those are potentially different people and think differently.
Interesting.
The architect person that's really in the engine may not have as much experience with what are customers actually doing, especially in a large company. And the designer may not have knowledge about like, how is this built? And, what are my limitations? And so then the communication between those organizations becomes your next, again, problem you choose to have instead of the intertwining code. Now it's a question of like, hey guys, I want to be able to do this, that, and the other thing, and having an engineer understand, oh, I see what you want to do. I can do this and not have it be something that's handed back and it looks like my child's first drawing for Halloween or something. So
No,
that's another problem in and of itself.
For sure. And just like to follow that up, because like I'm always been a fan of trying to get somebody from the business side, from the development side, and then somebody on the design side, whether it's me or somebody else, like actually in a room arguing on a whiteboard. And I don't mean arguing like in a negative context. Yep. Like I want to discuss it. I want to talk about like, what can we build? And before any line of code is written or anything's been designed, we're going to have a rough wireframe done on the whiteboard, just so then we can all say, yeah, I think that's really buildable. And yes, that's designable. And that's going to make sense for our users. But how do you leverage kind of AI and big data into that as well? Because historically, we all know that Amazon and Google, and I'm sure there's tons of other companies that as well, that are like, well, this shade of blue converts better than that shade of blue, so we're going to use this one. And it's really hard to argue with that, right? Like I might hate blue. I don't. But if I did, for example, and it's just like that ruins the whole design. But if the design's working and that blue button converts compared to, I don't know, the orange one that I had there originally, for example, how do you manage that like push and pull between all the different different sides of the coin there?
Yeah. Short answer, because there's a long one, probably more the book in and of itself. But I think that the first thing you have to understand is what is the customer trying to do and what's your real goal? What are you measuring against? Any of the good stuff that you'd talk about if you're talking about whether it's funnel conversion or user customer journey or things like this. I think where, your example, which is a good one, which is like, hey, let's wireframe this on the whiteboard, probably starts with a user story. Like as a user, I want to do the following thing so that I can do X. And that aspect of it is really, really critical to have right. And it has to be at the right altitude. A lot of times what people wind up doing is, in the case of a blue button, for example, it might be, as a user, I want to, I don't know, start a free trial so that I can understand your product better. And so in that particular case, it might be like, oh, and blue converts better for a free trial button, whatever.
Yeah.
And so, but really, is that the problem you're trying to solve, or is it like, hey, what is it I'm trying to solve? I'm trying to solve that this customers come in to use the product, they want to do something, and I want to show them the benefit and the power of this particular product. That has nothing to do with blue. That
Sure.
has everything to do with how am I solving this? So I think the first thing is understanding what altitude you're talking about and ensuring that you're at the right altitude for the problem that's at hand. I think the second one that's very interesting out of that one, the one I see in spades anywhere I go, is that when after that meeting that you just had, the engineer goes away, creates a spec, or the designer goes away, creates a spec, they meet a couple times, et cetera. And then you go into, if you're doing agile, you go into sprint planning meetings, and then you go into, triage meetings. And that's where I think these things break down, because usually people don't have the business owner in the room. And the business decisions that are being traded off wind up being made by the people that don't own those decisions, whether that be an engineer or even a designer. And so what happens is, it becomes more of a, well, that's a little too hard for us to do. And you said you wanted this, next week. So we made this other thing and we did it like this. It's not quite your spec over there, Mr. Designer, but that's okay. And that kind of sort of connective tissue is really, really critical and really hard to get right, because you can't always have your CMO or somebody in every single triage meetings, but you really have to understand everybody's roles and responsibilities well enough so that you can make, again, the right call, but you can also understand, hey, I know what you're talking about, but we got to bop up the altitude on this one so that we actually make the right overarching decision. And I found that those kinds of things has nothing to do with what is the design or what's the architecture, but that communication step is the place where a lot of these can go very, very wrong.
100% agree. I also think that if you figure out what version one's going to be, and then you might talk about version 2, 3, 4, 5, but figure out what version one's going to be. But when you're doing design and development, you need to be thinking of, how can we expand this to future versions so we don't have to rewrite or refactor as much as possible, because that will ultimately happen in some cases. But I find if you think in that versioning, and it sounds like you agree with me, or what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, no, I think that mixed with, as we call, minimum viable product and things like this. I think for me, I think the push pull around that one winds up being, yes, I want to create something so that I can, build on it going forward. But MVP, too many times it winds up being M as a, big, huge capital M, as in it's the most minimal thing. And again, you've lost almost the higher level altitude of what are the use cases and problems you're trying to solve. And then it doesn't have, because you architected for the future, it potentially doesn't have the functionality that is really expected. And I'll give you 3 examples of that. Sure. One actually was InDesign 1.0. InDesign 1.0 didn't have quite all the things in it, and it was kind of like everybody was like, wah, wah, wah. It was like, oh my God, really? But obviously we had built it for, infinite extensibility, and it succeeded. PicMonkey Mobile, actually, I'll blame ourselves. That was another example where we had so many expectations on a product that we actually made an MVP, but it wasn't solving all of the use cases, not all of them, but the core ones, if you will. And then if you look at the blowback that Adobe's getting for Photoshop on the iPad, as an example, right? That's another example where great product, but the kinds of things that people want to do for that were just, missing a couple of notes, if you will. And I think that's the bigger problem. People get into the troika of, we have a time to market issue. We can only fit so much code in a 5-pound bag. and it has to meet all of these use cases. And that sort of mixture, I usually find the MVP has to really solve a core set of use cases so that people continue to come back. And if it doesn't, then you're not hitting that MVP, but even, product market fit, if you will. And that I think is super dangerous. And so I think it comes back to altitude, but it's this fine crafting of those kind of dimensions that I think is super interesting in and of itself.
No, I 100% agree with you, and I'm sure we could probably go on for another hour, but we're sadly out of time.
Okay. Yeah.
And so how about we close with mentioning where people can get more information about yourself and PicMonkey?
Yeah, so PicMonkey is just simply www.picmonkey.com. That's our online application, free to try, all that stuff. We also have iOS and Android versions of PicMonkey up in the app stores. Download them; it's free to use. And there's also some photography stuff and all the rest of that you can see on my websites. But PicMonkey is there for people to try out.
Perfect. Well, again, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day, man.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ken.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Please visit our website at buildingthefutureshow.com to join the free community, sign up for our newsletter, or to sponsor the show. The music is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.